He had not said the boy's name in 9 years. No one in Marrow Creek had. Not the mothers who still crossed themselves at the sight of frozen water. Not the boys who skated the far end of the creek but never the pond. Not even Josiah King, who had buried him. The rule was never written down. It didn't need to be. In a community that ran on what was said and what was understood to never be said again, silence was its own kind of law. And this was the oldest one. No child crosses Miller's pond ice. No one speaks his name. What is broken stays broken. Amos Lance had kept that rule better than anyone. 24 years old now, hands rough from 9 winters of fence work, hat worn low but never crooked, coat buttonless and plain at the collar the way his father's had been and his father's before that. He was the kind of quiet that made people forget he was in the room. Some mistook it for slowness. It wasn't. It was the particular quiet of a man who had trained himself never to be the one who spoke first. Under the lining of that coat, sewn there by his own hand, restitched every spring when the thread wore thin, was 40 feet of rope. No one knew it was there. Not his mother, not the bishop, not even the girl he sometimes walked home from Sunday service who thought his silence was shyness. Before that winter was over, that rope would be the only thing standing between a 7-year-old girl and the bottom of Miller's Pond. And a word Amos Lance had not spoken out loud in 9 years, a name no one in Marrow Creek dared say since the funeral, would do something the rope alone never could. It would break Josiah King open. Marrow Creek sat in the fold of 2 low hills in eastern Ohio, the kind of place a highway forgets on purpose. 60 families, 1 schoolhouse, a phone shanty at the edge of the Yoder property that the community used only for what could not wait. He did not own a phone. He did not know what a smartphone looked like unlocked. He paid the feed store in cash folded twice in his coat pocket and never once asked for a receipt, because a receipt was for a man who needed proof of what he'd done, and Amos had spent 9 years being a man who needed no one to see him at all. What he did own, hidden in a trunk under a false bottom his grandfather had built for something else entirely, were 4 library books on cold water rescue, ice load calculation, and hypothermia response, ordered through a mail service he'd found listed on a bulletin board at the feed store, paid for with money he told his mother was for new boots. He had read them by lantern light so many times the spines had split. He had practiced knots with his eyes closed until his fingers didn't need his eyes at all. He never told anyone why. The reason had a name, and the name was the one thing in Marrow Creek that could not be said out loud. That reason went back 9 years, to when Amos had been 15. Isaac King had been 9, Josiah's youngest, the boy who ran instead of walked, who asked why about everything twice. The ice on Miller's Pond had looked solid enough that December. It had held for 3 days. On the 4th, it hadn't. Amos had been the closest one. He'd heard the crack before he saw it happen, and he had gone in after Isaac with nothing. No rope, no plan, no idea what cold water does to a 15-year-old's arms in under 90 seconds. He got a hand on Isaac's coat once, lost it. Got close enough a second time to hear him stop calling for help, which was worse than the calling had been. By the time the men reached them both, Amos was alive because the current had pushed him toward the bank. Isaac was not. No one in Marrow Creek ever said it was Amos's fault. That was the strange cruelty of it. Nobody needed to. Josiah stopped looking at him at service. The other boys' fathers found reasons for their sons to work fences with someone else. Amos was not shunned. He was simply, gently, permanently unseen, the way a community absorbs a wound by deciding not to touch the place where it hurts. He decided, at 15, 2 things. That he would never again be the boy standing on a bank with nothing in his hands, and that he would never make anyone say Isaac's name to explain why. He kept both promises for 9 years, until the winter the rope finally came out of his coat. It started as a work frolic. 6 families out at the King property clearing brush along the creek line before the ground froze hard, children sledding the low rise above the pond while their fathers worked. Josiah King, 61 now, silver-bearded, stood at the top of that rise with his hands behind his back, the way he always stood, watching children he had told himself he was watching closely enough. Naomi King was 7, Josiah's granddaughter, Isaac's niece, though she had never known that. No one had told her whose pond this was, or why her grandfather's jaw tightened every time her sled ran too close to it. The sled went over the lip of the rise faster than anyone judged it would. It carried her onto the ice before a single adult had finished turning around. The crack was the same sound Amos had heard 9 years before. He was 40 yards off, mending a rail. He heard it, and every year between 15 and 24 disappeared at once. What happened on the bank in the next 90 seconds was, afterward, the thing every witness described differently, and every witness agreed on the same shape. Josiah ran first, every grandfather would, and stopped 6 feet from the edge, because some part of him, some old animal part that had never healed, knew exactly what thin ice does to a grown man's weight and could not make his legs carry him past that knowledge. He stood there, frozen in the specific way a man freezes when his body remembers a grief his mind is still trying to survive. 2 other men reached for him, for rope, for anything, and found nothing, because no one had ever prepared for a thing no one was permitted to discuss. Amos was already moving. He crossed the rise at a flat run, coat open, and did not slow at the bank the way the others had. He went down onto his stomach at the edge, distributing his weight the way the books had taught him, and began paying out 40 feet of rope from a coil no one in Marrow Creek had ever seen before, tied with a bowline he could have made blind. Josiah's voice cracked across the ice before Amos reached the girl. "Get back, you'll die out there, boy, get back." It wasn't cruelty. It was 9 years of terror finally finding a sentence. Amos did not get back. What he said instead, low, almost too quiet for the wind to carry, the first time in 9 years he let that name leave his mouth in front of another human being, was one word. Isaac. Not as an accusation, not even really to Josiah. He said it the way a man says a name he has carried alone for so long that saying it out loud is the only way to explain. Without a single other word, why he had spent 9 years teaching himself something no one asked him to learn. I did not save him. I'm not going to fail her the same way. Josiah went still in a different way than before. The ice held Amos for 4 more feet than it should have, and then it didn't, and for 3 seconds Marrow Creek watched 2 people go under instead of 1. He came up with Naomi's collar in his fist. What the books had taught him: spread the weight, kick backward, not forward, use the rope as a track and not a line to be hauled on. He did in the water with hands already losing feeling, because he had rehearsed cold water in his mind so many times that his body knew the sequence before his mind caught up to the pain. He got her onto the unbroken shelf of ice. He pushed her toward the men now finally moving, finally understanding what the rope tied to the fence post was for. One of them turned and ran for the phone shanty at the Yoder property without being told to. It was the first time in 9 years anyone in Marrow Creek had run toward it for a reason like this. Amos did not come out of the water as easily as Naomi did. It took 3 men and the rope both ways to pull him from Miller's Pond. Blue-lipped, silent even then, still holding the coil the way a man holds the one thing he built his whole life around. Josiah King knelt beside him on the ice-crusted bank and did something the community had never once seen him do in 9 years. He opened Amos's coat to get him warmer, and his hand found the lining, the place where the stitching was thicker than it should be, worn smooth from 9 years of re-sewing. He understood before anyone explained it to him. The boy he had stopped looking at for nearly a decade had spent every one of those years quietly preparing to do the thing Josiah himself had never let anyone prepare to do. Because preparing meant admitting it could happen again, and admitting that meant saying Isaac's name. And Josiah had made an iron rule out of his own unbearable grief and called it wisdom. He had blamed a 15-year-old boy for not being trained to save his son, and that boy had spent 9 years training in secret rather than ever once say so. What happened in the weeks after was not loud. Marrow Creek does not do loud. A county reporter did come. A few days later, after an EMT at the hospital where Naomi was checked and released mentioned an Amish man had pulled a girl from the ice. He drove out hoping for a photograph. Amos's mother met him at the end of the lane and told him politely that there was nothing here worth his gasoline. He left. The story that ran was 3 paragraphs long with no names in it, which was exactly how Amos wanted it, and he never knew the reporter had come at all. What did happen, on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks later, was smaller and heavier than any headline. Josiah King walked the mile and a half to the Lance farm alone, in the dark, and knocked on a door he had not knocked on in 9 years. He did not apologize the way the English apologize, with a speech built for an audience. He sat at the table, turned his hat in his hands the way old men do when the next sentence costs them something, and said that the rule about the pond, the rule about the name, was lifted. That it should never have existed in the form it took. That a boy who tried, at 15, with nothing in his hands, had spent 9 years quietly making sure no other family would ever stand where the Kings had stood. He said Isaac's name 3 times that night, out loud, in front of Amos, as if to prove to both of them that the word no longer had the power to break the house down around it. Amos did not become a different man after that night. He did not stop being quiet, did not start speaking at service, did not accept when the township wanted to give him a certificate for what he'd done. He sent it back unopened, not out of spite, but because recognition had never been what the rope was for. He still mends fences. He still pays in cash folded twice. He still owns no phone. But he no longer sews rope into a coat lining that no one is allowed to ask about. 3 winters later, when Marrow Creek's school committee finally allowed it, Amos Lance stood in front of a room of children, the first time he had spoken to a group in his adult life, and taught them plainly without ceremony what to do if the ice ever cracked beneath someone they loved. He did not tell them why he knew. He didn't have to. By then, everyone did. Some rules are not built from wisdom. They are built from grief wearing wisdom's clothes, and they hold only as long as no one is brave enough, or broken enough, or loving enough to say the one word that unravels them. Amos Lance said his on the ice, in a whisper the wind almost took before it reached the man who needed to hear it most. It was enough.